Good evening. Here together on another Wednesday for another midweek reflection. So I hope these have been helpful and have given you a little something to think about in the middle of the week. But we've been walking through Pastor Scott Saul's book, A Gentle Answer. If this is the first one you're seeing, maybe go back and look at the last couple of weeks. I like the subtitle of the book. Title is A Gentle Answer. Subtitle is Our Secret Weapon in an Age of Us Against Them. And of course, the secret weapon from the subtitle is Jesus. And so that's our secret weapon. So the book's broken up into two sections. And first few chapters were about the gentleness that Jesus has for us as people and what this does for us in our lives, and how that helps us then change. And that's the second part of the book, is how his gentleness changes us. And all along the way, talking about different aspects about how we are able to interact with one another and to treat one another and kind of go against this us versus them culture, this very polarized society we are living in. So last week we moved into part 2 with a chapter on having a little bit thicker skin as Christians. Or at least we're supposed to, which is one of the ways that Jesus changes us. But we talked about that we shouldn't think of every little put down that might come our way as persecution. There's a lot more persecution going on around the world, and other Christians in the western part of the world. We are pretty fortunate. We're pretty lucky that we don't have a lot of the things to deal with that folks in other parts of the world does. And so what do we do? How do we, do our part and see through? And so there's a lot of injustice around us in our communities and throughout the world. So one of the ways we talked about is we strive for justice and also show courage to help aid those around the world. And sometimes that's speaking truth to power. It's maybe getting involved behind the scenes and helping a little bit of change happen. So our response as Christians should lead the communities around us in how to interact with one another. And Pastor Scott Sauls, he challenged us by saying this, and I quote from the end of last week as well: "For if Christians don't go first in offering a gentle answer to those who oppose us, can we ever expect those who oppose us to make a similar move?" And we talked a little bit about when there's some tension between Christian beliefs and non-Christian beliefs, and the back and forth that happens, not necessarily persecution, but it's disagreement. Disagreement leads to tension. How is it that we interact with one another at that time? And that takes a little bit of courage. So I'll continue with the quote. "And if Christians don't take the first step to humble ourselves and become less testy, less defensive, less easily offended, and less vindictive when we experience milder forms of opposition and criticism than the global norm, who will?" And so that was our food for thought as we ended last week. And so our next topic, after having thicker skin, well, we're going to talk about doing anger well. We're going to talk about how anger is okay, real briefly, just to touch on this subject. And I've talked about, I know before, about holding grudges, and in describing what a grudge does to the grudge holder, I've used this illustration before, and that's this. Holding a grudge is like taking a spoonful of poison and waiting for the other person to become sick. The grudge is only doing you harm, even though you want it to harm someone else. So if you're holding a grudge, more than likely you're angry. And the above illustration could be used for anger too, I suppose. So even though we may want our anger to ravage the hated ones, it will only backfire and ravage our souls. But there is an anger that can be kept in check and be used for fruitful ministry. It sounds funny, I know, but anger is okay and even encouraged in Scripture. From Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, the first part of this verse, Paul simply says this: "In your anger, do not sin." And there's the last part of that verse is one that folks may have heard of. Don't let the sun set on your anger. Don't go to bed angry. Work through whatever's going on in your life. And so, in your anger, do not sin. So here Paul is actually quoting from Psalm chapter 4, verse 4. He's using scripture that Jewish folks would have been familiar with from the Psalms, book of Psalms. So notice, though, We're not told to not be angry. He says, do not be angry, do not sin. That's not what's said, but it is in our anger, do not sin. For some, this may seem counterintuitive to what Jesus tells us in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 about turning the other cheek and blessing our enemies, praying for our enemies. These statements made by Jesus aren't telling us that we can never be angry. They're telling us how to treat and interact with others, treat others and interact with others. We can both be angry and treat others well. This is where the second part of Paul's quote from Psalms comes into play, the do not sin part. We can be angry, but we're not to sin. In your anger, do not sin. So there are accounts of Jesus' anger meter rising up in himself throughout the Gospels. And here are a few examples from Matthew. Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 and 13, we see Jesus overturning the tables in the temple courts. There's a great injustice being done, and he's proving a point. He's making sure that this injustice gets corrected, that folks learn a lesson. Matthew chapter 23, in a longer story, verses 13 through 39, he calls religious leaders names. In my opinion, the names aren't, I guess, a bad sort of name calling. He's just placing a label on it. He's telling it like it is. This is who you guys are, whether you realize it or not. Trying to teach a lesson, trying to move them forward. Matthew chapter 16, verse 23. You might remember Peter or Jesus getting mad at Peter and calling him Satan. Get behind me, Satan. If people weren't going to be held accountable, then nothing would change. Jesus was angry, though, because he loved and wanted the best for everybody, especially the marginalized. Jesus shows us that anger, when channeled correctly, resembles one part of the fruit of the Spirit, which is patience. It's an anger that doesn't want to strike back or seek revenge, but correct a wrong. And that takes a lot of patience to kind of go about it the right way, to channel that anger, to harness that anger. Sometimes anger is compared to fire. Fire, in and of itself, has a lot of good qualities. Has a lot of good purposes and good uses. But if it's let out of its cage, so to speak, or let out of its fire pit, if you think about fire pit, let out of its containment, and then it can be trouble. And then fire can be trouble. And the same goes for anger. So what do we do with this? How might we live this out today? What does using anger for good look like in our culture, in our community, in our own spheres of influence? Pastor Saulson, talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, reflects this way. He says, according to King, people of color were left fending for themselves in a world that was stacked against them. With little patience left for such neglect and betrayal, he wrote, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. King did make demands which eventually caused white leaders, including President Lyndon B. Johnson, to begin taking the cause of racial equality and justice seriously. Though we still have a long way to go, no one would argue that King's contribution, much of which was born from what we call righteous anger, moved the ball forward significantly in the realm of civil rights. In addition to his courage and leadership, King also modeled a specific way of expressing anger that embodied and promoted righteousness as opposed to sin. Without resorting to vindictiveness or violence or retribution, folks, we must be willing not only to feel but to voice the anger of God against all forms of unjust violence toward human bodies and souls. Christianity, which is far from being a disinterested passive religion with respect to violation of human rights, must go on the offense. As C.S. Lewis reminds us, Christianity is a fighting religion that thinks that a great many things have gone wrong with the world that God made, and that God insists very loudly on putting them right again. Fighting not in the form of physical fight, but simply fighting for what's right, trying to make movement forward to better the world for everybody. In our current culture of outrage and of us versus them, what does it mean for us to be angry but not sin? What does it mean for us to live out our anger, to let our anger express itself but not to sin? We have examples of this throughout world history. Mother Teresa speaking to power when she was invited to the White House to speak at the National Prayer Breakfast, among many other times in her life. Or Gandhi and his desire for civil rights in South Africa and in his own country of India, and to help free his people from British rule. Maybe you know of someone more regional or local from your lifetime. Folks, when we harness the anger and express it well, it can do a lot of great things. As we see in Scripture, as I mentioned before, Jesus got angry from time to time, but we're called not to sin, not to seek revenge, not to be violent, but to simply do our best to express what needs to happen. For some, speaking truth to power, that's come up over the last few weeks, letting folks know that things aren't right and they need to be changed. Or maybe it is finding a way for us to make a small change in and of itself. It's okay to be angry. It's how we express that anger. That is all the difference. Folks, I hope that you have a good week. I look forward to seeing everybody on Sunday. If it's nice weather, we'll be back in the front part of the church under the shade trees. And also remember that this is our Noisy Collection Week, so we're collecting for our sponsor, John Melissa, and also for UMCOR for the hurricane cleanup and the hurricane disasters in the South here from a couple weeks ago. So that's what we'll be collecting for our Noisy collection. So, all right, folks. Hope the rest of your rainy Wednesday goes well, and we'll talk to you later.